I'm Matthew Kurbis, the subscription attorney, and this is Law Subscribed, your dedicated source for all things subscriptions and the law. Thank you to my sponsors. See links to them in the show notes. Everything discussed is only for educational and entertainment purposes. Enjoy the show. I'm thrilled to have with me today on the Law Subscribed podcast, Jack Shelton. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So if any of my listeners also can sometimes check out MatthewKurbis.com, where I post everywhere that I've appeared on a podcast. Maybe you'll have heard recently that I was on a podcast with Jack called The Geek in Review, and they brought us on because we're both doing innovative things with our law practices. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to actually get to know Jack and his background. But in case my listeners haven't heard that interview yet, Jack, go ahead and give yourself a little introduction.
Sure. So I'm Jack Shelton, and I guess my origin story is right after coming out of law school, I went and I worked as in-house counsel for an ocean carrier in Germany for a bit. And then went from there. I did a master's in maritime law at Tulane. And so I was practicing law down in New Orleans for a while. And a lot of that was transactional work, but I kind of got sucked into a lot of the litigation work as well. And that was a lot of litigation representing insurance carriers, of course, which meant lots of billing and coding and doing all that stuff that's really obnoxious. After several years in New Orleans, I moved to a firm in Memphis, then I moved to a firm in Nashville, kind of bounced around a little bit, trying to build out an international trade practice. I had a bit of difficulty just finding the right spot. So I eventually just decided to go out on my own. I figured I'd be able to do it better just by myself without anybody to ask permission to do anything that was a little weird.
That's a common theme on the podcast with my guests, I'd say.
Yeah, man, it's really tough when there's a committee that has to review every decision and any changes to the website. Well, we'll revisit that in 6 months. Now I can just change my website whenever I want. I can just do whatever I want. So it's nice. It's nice being nimble and just being able to make a decision on the wall. So let's see. I started my own firm just a little bit before COVID hit. Mm-hmm. And like 2 weeks later, found out my wife is pregnant with our first child. Having just given up my salary, which is a little terrifying. Fortunately, the reason why I felt comfortable leaving and starting my own thing is because I was able to secure one client who was willing to pay me, I think at the time it was $4,000 a month to be kind of a fractional in-house counsel. Mm-hmm. And I basically just told, and we were already somewhat tight at the time. He's doing some freight forwarding and some international trade. And so I knew a lot about what his business needed, and I could respond really quickly. And so basically I just told him, look, you pay me this amount every month, I'll do whatever you want. I'm there for you, whatever you need. And I knew he wasn't going to abuse me for that. So it worked out great. That was enough that I could pay my bills. Right. wasn't living high on the hog at the time, but it was enough I could pay my bills. And that, gave me time to find new clients as well, of course. So then COVID hit. And there were a lot of companies getting into this really weird world of trying to sell PPE, like masks and gloves and COVID test kits and things like that. And all of these international deals, nobody knew what the hell they were doing. But I got a handful of clients that were in other industries that they're like, hey, our business is shut down, but we've got a lot of money. So let's try to do this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so they engaged me on a monthly basis as well. And so I had like 3 or 4 clients that were just doing fractional in-house counsel or fractional outsourced counsel.
Yeah.
And it was great. I did okay during COVID. Did pretty well. And so then I got to the point where I had like a little bit too much work and I wasn't sleeping enough. So I reached out to the woman who became my co-founder. I had previously been putting out videos on YouTube explaining the international traffic and arms regulations. And she had been using those videos that I put out as in-house training. She was working at a big defense contractor. She was using that for training her staff. Anyway, she left a nice comment on one of my YouTube videos, and I got excited about that and reached out to her. And at the time, I was trying to develop training content. So I said, hey, I'm just going to develop content for you for free, and that'll help me develop the content that I can sell to other people. So that was a great relationship. And so when I finally reached out to her saying, hey, I've got extra work and I'm having trouble getting it done. Do you have extra time? She said, well, I don't really want to work for this defense contractor anymore. Do you want to just be partners? Great. And yeah, we had met one time in person before that. She was living in Philadelphia and I was living in Albuquerque. We had met one time when she was traveling through a city that I was in, and we met at a Cracker Barrel for lunch.
And are
And
you still like remote from each other, like apart?
yeah,
Yeah.
and we're like best friends now, and we've met in person like 3 or 4 times. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, the remote work thing worked out really well for us, and so our firm is entirely remote. See, I'm currently in Memphis. She's currently in North Carolina. We've both moved a couple times. We've got an attorney in Newport, Rhode Island. We've got a couple in the DC area, but one of them is about to move to Guam because she's a military spouse and her husband's a submarine commander.
Mm-hmm.
We had somebody in California. Let's see, we've got Illinois. Well, we're all over the place.
Well, your accountants must love you because of all the different jurisdictions of taxes and employment taxes and stuff, and federal practice and international law practice, right? So that's how you're able to. Attorneys can be anywhere.
There's very little that we touch that's state specific, except when it's like, okay, we're standing up a Delaware C corp.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody cares
because that's ministerial. Because LegalZoom and Stripe Atlas, like they could do that, and they're not law firms. Yeah.
So the overwhelming majority of what we do is purely federal work. It's U.S. export controls, or it's federal government contracting, or getting FCC licenses. So I guess I better explain what I do, because none of that makes any sense to an audience.
Let's say the name of the firm is Aegis Space Law.
Yeah.
So that's just a quick little primer there, and yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what you do, and then I wanna pull some threads from your journey so far.
Okay, so when Bailey and I first started working, we were doing mostly international trade work. We weren't focused on any particular industry, and so the original name of our firm was Aegis Trade Law, and it still is. We've just started using a DBA.
Right.
And so we were doing international trade transactions, but we were also doing a bit of federal government contracting and U.S. export controls. For those who don't know what that means, there are a lot of things in this country that the government is jealous to protect, both the hardware itself as well as the underlying technology. Weapons are an obvious example, but even things like CNC machines, like a milling machine that can mill things out, that can be used to make just normal commercial stuff, but it can also be used to make a missile. And so the government says, hey, we need to protect that stuff. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment's a really big one right now. You can't send that stuff to China. So there are two different sets of regulations. There's the International Traffic in Arms regulations. There's also one called the Export Administration regulations. And they have these lists of stuff that are controlled at various levels of control. Some of the things you just like can't ever send out of the country without getting a license from the government first. And then sometimes it just depends on the country you're sending things to. So that's export controls in a nutshell. After we were working together for a little while, we were doing some work for some, defense contractors and for some just international trading companies. I can't remember exactly how it came up, but Bailey said that she had an interest in the space industry and that she had volunteered for some fairly large nonprofit organizations in the space industry, like Commercial Space Flight Federation and things that I knew nothing at all about. I didn't know anything about space, but we talked about it. And I said, man, like I like what I do because I'm good at it, but I'm not passionate about any particular industry. I mean, there's nothing that excites me other than I just want to do good work and, take care of my family, Mm-hmm. So if you're passionate about something, let's definitely just dive in head first because that can be exciting. One of us should be excited about what we're doing. So we started doing that and we explored it. And it turned out that what small businesses and medium-sized businesses in the space industry needed was people who knew export controls and federal government contracting. Those are like the biggest things that they needed. The major problem that they're running into is the only law firms that would deal with them were the big boy law firms. And we quickly realized that their rates for partners were like $1,500 an hour.
Yeah.
just absolutely insane. And so we quickly said, oh, we can undercut that and do very well. I live in Memphis. The highest rate anyone charges in Memphis is $500. Like nobody charges more than that. It's weird to charge more than that.
Mhm.
So $1,500 an hour is just patently absurd to me. But I think that a lot of the people who hire those bigger law firms, well, we can get into the whole psychology of why people hire law firms to appease their board of directors later.
Sure, sure. Then let's get into it then, because first of all, I'm curious to know: are you still representing that client that was your first client when you went solo? Are they still a
Not as
subscriber?
much because he's kind of the guy who owns those businesses is stepping back a little bit and
Okay.
control over other folks, and they just don't have as much need.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And we've shifted more to the space stuff, and
that
I'm not tracking freight forwarding regulations as much as I was before,
right.
but it occasionally.
Yeah. But thinking about that relationship, because it sounds to me like that was the origin of you just using this pay me every month fractional GC model, and that was sort of your origin process. Like, was that a you thing? Did you suggest that? Did he suggest that? Like, what was that
Yeah,
origin
I
for
suggested it.
subscription?
I think I would have suggested it because I've been doing work for him before, just on an hourly basis, and if I remember right, I might have actually started doing a subscription with him at the last firm that I was at prior to going out on my own. There was a lady at that firm who was doing transactional work also like me, and she had a cool subscription model, and she was charging people, businesses, $200 a month just to be on call. Now, the $200 a month didn't buy you any substantive time. Like if she needed to go research something, you're going to pay for it. If she needed to write like a formal memo or write a contract, anything substantive, you're going to have to pay for it. But the $200 a month meant that if you called her on her cell phone, she was going to pick it up and she's going to do her best to answer your question right there on the spot. And very often, what it would be, an employer who's like, "Hey, I've got this employee who's doing this weird thing. What should I do?" And those people need somebody to call in those situations. And so that's what it was for. And then she would just give like the quick advice. Hey, here's something. I haven't researched this yet, but here's the sensible thing to do. Don't do this other stupid thing. And so she would give that quick advice for that $200 a month, which I think was very valuable to a lot of people. I think it's very valuable to those companies because more often than not, what they would do is just something stupid rather than calling an attorney because they don't know who to call. And they're also scared of getting billed.
Do you
And
remember who it was? Like, who's her, what's her name, if you recall?
her name is J.K. Elkin. And she moved on to a different firm now. And I am blanking on the name of that firm right now. But
That's enough for me to find her. That's
yeah, you'll
enough for me.
find her. She ought to be in Nashville. Anyway, yeah, go look her up. She's great. I love JK.
So okay, wow. So she introduces you to this model,
Yeah.
this idea. So that's sort of so you tested it out with a client. Then when you went solo, was it a conscious decision to be like, now I'm just going to do this stuff and I don't want to build time anymore? Like, what was that thought process like?
So throughout my career before that, I had always been really bad at billing time. So
I've never met a lawyer. I've never met one who says I'm the best biller. I love billing. Billing's my favorite thing in the world. I've never met that lawyer.
there's just some people who are more diligent about that sort of a thing. Just look, I got to admit where my weaknesses are. That's one of my weaknesses. Like, I just hate it so much. I hate it so much. Just like writing down everything I'm doing as I'm doing it. And there would be just so many months where there would be that stress at the end of the month. It's like, did I capture everything? Are the partners going to be mad at me because I didn't write things down? And so much of what I was doing also was like building products and other things that were like non-billable things,
Yeah.
creative kind of things. And
Value generating things, just not billable
yeah,
hour
yeah,
things.
yeah.
Right.
So they're things that to partners in a bigger firm who aren't used to that kind of thing, but they just churn, churn, churn. They look at that, they're like, we're not making immediate money from this guy. What's happening?
Yeah, I suggested the subscription model to my firm that I was at before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit and they were like, tell us again about this subscription thing that you talked to us about. Because I was working at an insurance defense firm, billing time in court. There was no court for like 6 months, So you got to find other revenue streams. But yeah, nobody cares until it's like, not an option anymore. And of course, I had to leave to start my own thing. Actually, we got pregnant in the beginning of the pandemic too, although I hadn't left my firm yet. So I wasn't quite in the same situation as you.
I'm so glad that I left before finding out that my wife was pregnant, because otherwise I think I would have tried to do what I thought was more responsible and stayed with the salary.
Right, right. I mean, obviously it's all worked out, but then as you grew that practice and then eventually pivoted to space law, was there what was your goal? What were you trying to achieve were you maintaining the subscription? Were you still doing some billable stuff, flat fee stuff? What was your business model throughout that journey that you've told us?
Yeah, so we were really trying to stick to subscriptions as much as possible. And it wasn't always the easiest thing to figure out. The great benefit in the beginning is my partner and I just didn't care that much about getting the math perfect in terms of between us two who's getting what. Mm-hmm. We basically just said, let's just do everything we can to get stuff in the door and get subscriptions going and do good work, and let's just split everything.
Yeah. Because I will say, other than maybe one or two other interviews in, around 100 episodes, where maybe a little more than half are lawyers who are doing some version of subscription, I think there's only one or two other interviews that somebody has a partner. So this is far less common. I mean, you said you got started on your own doing it, which we've seen, but bringing true partners in versus just hiring or outsourcing is a different story. So tell us more about how that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have 4 partners. And 3 of us are doing more of the export controls and government contracting and things like that tend to fall within the subscription thing. Mm-hmm. And we have 1 partner who does a lot more of telecoms work. And so for the non-space people who are listening, if you are on planet Earth and you want to talk to a satellite, you want to control it, for example, and give it inputs to tell it where to go, or you want to downlink information such as imagery or positional information, anything like that, you have to use radio waves to talk to the satellite. You have to apply to the FCC to get a chunk of radio spectrum assigned to you. Otherwise, you'd have lots of interference and big problems, both domestically and internationally. There's a body within the United Nations called the International Telecoms Union. And so you have to coordinate with them and file an application through the FCC. This is all pretty new stuff, because until 5 minutes ago, it was only governments doing this, and then a couple of commercial players. Now it's there's a lot more commercial players in space. Mm-hmm. And so the processes are changing all the time. Anyway, that's all to say that one of our partners focuses on that stuff. That stuff is just so complicated. It's a lot less predictable about how much time commitment it's going to be for any kind of a project. We got written up in an article called in a periodical called Payload the other day. Payload Space. There's two big publications. There's a couple more, Space News and Payload. And there was an article about this company that just had to get an FCC license on an incredibly short timeline. They're just no, that's impossible. We can't do it. And then my partner Will took it on and just did an incredible job and kind of pulled a miracle out and got it done. But those are the kinds of things where it's incredibly hard to predict the time commitments. So anyway, he tends not to do the subscription thing where the rest of us do. He tends to bill hourly, although we're trying to figure out ways in which we could say, all right, what are the different functions that are being performed? How can we chunk those out? How can we figure out how much time goes into this function versus that function? How could we turn it into a process? We're trying to think about that for everything that we do.
If I may be so bold, as the host of the Law Subscribed podcast, having interviewed a lot of folks, so I have this collective knowledge. So there's an interview, an episode that I had with Sean Hardeen of Big Yellow Penguin. Now, this is a big value-based pricing guy. And so there's a lot of overlap in terms of philosophical alignment with subscription value-based pricing, that they don't always go hand in hand. Mm. And one of the things he talked about is he said, well, you could give somebody at least 2, maybe 3 options of what's it worth for you, and you give them a timeline. I could get this done for you in 30 days. It's going to be X amount. I could get this done for you in 15 days. It's going to be X times 2. Or I could get this done for you tomorrow, and it's going to be X times 10. And so you value-based price it. What's the value of the work? You know, if the company getting that telecoms license, the FCC license, if that's going to be worth $2 million to them, maybe it's worth $100,000 to get it done in the next 30 days, right? So like that could be an alternative to subscription, because the reality is get it done as fast as possible is the value. So value-based pricing might be approach to take with his kind of work. What do you think about something like that?
Could be. It's certainly something I could raise with them and see if you'd be interested in it. And then of course there's other things you could do too. Like you can, with subscriptions, what we do with our subscriptions is we say, hey, here's about how much time we think you're going to need in a given quarter. Let's say 20 hours. So here's your price for 20 hours. And we recognize that there are going to be some quarters where you're going to go over, and then there's going to be some quarters where you're under. And as long as it's like a little bit over or a little bit under, we're not going to care. We're not going to bill you anything extra. And we don't have to be extremely precise with our hours either, because I don't want to track my hours. However, if it looks like on a recurring basis, you're not using us, we're going to give you a call and say, hey, let's drop down to a lower tier. You're not using us that much. Or on a recurring basis, if you're just hammering us with phone calls every day and really going over your time, we're going to say, hey, what do you think about for the next quarter? We bump it up to the next tier because you're kind of using us a lot. And everybody's been happy with that so far. So, I mean, that's also something that we could do on, potentially on the FCC side if we wanted to do that, or we can say, hey, here's your tier, here's our target number of hours. If you go above this number of hours, we're going to start charging you hourly. There's all different kinds of ways to play with it. We just, on that side, haven't put the time in, I guess, to really play with different things.
First of all, I just want to say what Will is doing is still satellites in space, and so it's still space law to me, even though you called it telecom. if it's touching, I think that's still in the niche of the firm. But
Sure.
So that just comes to mind. But the other thing is, and maybe we have to enter a subscription therapy session here, because if you're tracking time, man, you're not on pure subscription. You got to stop tracking time. What are you doing to yourself? Why do you find that you're still tracking your time and counting hours?
Well, to some extent, it's good to know how much time you're spending on stuff. I don't want to do it, but that's a fault of mine, I think.
Isn't it true, though, and I think you'll agree, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you're tracking your time for subscription work where you're not billing by the hour, isn't it you want to spend less time on these things? Like, that's the goal, because if you could spend less time, like I could appreciate to a certain point tracking time for subscription flat fee billable work, because you don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But over time, once you figure out, okay, we spent an hour on this project, how could we spend 30 minutes on this project next time? And then you do. And then you find out a way to spend 15 minutes on it. And then, like, what are you tracking your time for anymore? So there's like diminishing returns, though I could appreciate the value in tracking it a little bit. So, I mean, do you like agree with that in principle? And
Yeah.
How does that apply to how you're tracking right now?
So with respect to just trying to keep internal metrics, I think we're just trying to get a good idea. We're trying to get a good picture of the health of the firm in terms of, like, gosh, I kind of want to know if one partner is spending twice as much time dealing with client matters as another partner, and we might want to look at that and say, hey, should we be redistributing some of the work a little bit to ease the burden on you? Is somebody just doing way more work than somebody else? Is somebody doing a lot of work on a particular project that's not getting done? I think it's healthy to look at those things. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily need to get down to 6-minute increments, but it'd be good to know generally what's happening.
So, I mean, here's what I do. And I'm a solo, so this is easier for me. And I actually don't do a lot of looking back. But if I was in a larger practice, maybe I would. So clients don't just get to call me. They schedule calls with me in 15-minute increments. And when they need something that's longer than 15 minutes, and granted, I'm not space law. Maybe every single call has to be an hour call block for you guys, for your clients. But they'll schedule a call with me, and I'll know because it's on my calendar, okay, I spoke to so-and-so for 15 minutes. And I also know that in my scheduling software, I automatically give myself 15 minutes of buffer time because I might want to go over, because my clients usually do. And then I'm magnanimous. They feel like they got extra time for me. They're happy. They're more likely to stay subscribed, which is the goal, right? So, it says 15 minutes in the calendar. Maybe it says 30 minutes or an hour if I'm like doing a follow-up meeting on an operating agreement I drafted for a client, right? But then I also time block. So at the end of every day, I try to block what I'm going to do for the next day. And it'll say in that calendar entry, 45 minutes on whatever the project is. And I may or may not finish that project in 45 minutes. If I go under, I don't like change my calendar. I'll just move on to the next thing. But I can see, okay, over the last month, if I wanted to, I don't do this. Okay, I had blocked 3 hours of time for this client, and we spoke for 3 hours of calls. So like I could go back and look and see, okay, I spent 6 hours last month on this client. Like if I wanted to, but at least that way I'm not like tracking time in arrears. I'm planning my time ahead. And that's how my time is being measured, not necessarily backwards looking like billing time. Are you doing something like that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would say is that so often what I'll try to do is I'll try to block things out on my calendar going forward. So I'll have, for example, on Thursdays and Fridays, I've got these big blocks where I say, no calls, Jack is doing creative work, So I'm writing content, for example. I'll be creating templates for regulatory analysis for reviewing things, or I'll be making videos or things like that. And so it would be ideal if I actually stuck to that. And then I could look back on it and say, hey, this is how much time Jack spent on it. It never happens because I'll get a call and somebody's got an emergency and I've got to deal with it.
Oh, come on. Emergencies are top tier subscriptions. You mentioned tiers. Like if somebody wants to have the ability to call you and you pick up right away, like that is top tier subscriber material, right?
Yeah, we don't charge crazy rates. I think we charge rates that are very reasonable compared to our competition. Nevertheless, it's a lot. I mean, it's not anything that you should sneeze at. And so I think based on what we charge, we do want to make the promise that we're going to respond as quickly as possible. And like we really want to see our clients succeed. We're in a very small industry, and there's a lot that makes it really hard to be a space company. It's incredibly hard for space companies to raise money. So imagine that you're a software company in Silicon Valley, and you can pitch investors and say, hey, if I follow the model everybody else is following, then there's this off ramp we might be able to have in 3 years where we have an exit event, and then you're going to make untold amounts of money. And VCs, what they do is they say, hey, there's a 90% chance of failure. So we're going to take this many companies, and based on this idea that if one company does succeed, it's going to be within 3 or 4 years, we can invest in this group of companies. Space companies are different because they have to send things to space. So that exit event is not in 3 years, usually at least. It's quite a bit longer.
20 years.
VC money is difficult in the space industry. Now, a lot of them get it. And we have a client who, did a huge initial raise with Andreessen Horowitz, and I think they just raised another 95 million or something. But it's rarer for especially hardware companies in the space industry to raise money like that. And so they rely on government contracts. So they'll get DoD contracts that are called small business innovation and research agreements, and then they try to kind of get a little more and a little more. So,
but don't these hard tech? I mean, I know it's true of in outside of space, but I've seen more and more hard tech companies, which space is, like you said, like they're sending physical things, to layer on some version of a subscription something. Like there's some recurring revenue that they also try to generate. Are you seeing it? And that's not really law firm subscription based, but that is subscription, so it's relevant to the pod. Like, are you seeing any of your clients also tacking on legitimately some kind of like software or subscription benefit to the hard tech space thing that they're offering? And if you can't talk about any of it because you're aware of some confidential
I'm
client,
trying to think of a good example, and I'm not thinking of a good example that really fits what you're saying. And I think that there are recurring revenue models there. Most of what especially when you eventually get to the point of something like a Starlink where it's like B2C, but we've got a lot more B2B where it's like, I'll give you kind of a good example of something that is fairly common, where you'll have one company that makes a payload, and a payload being like a camera or some other kind of sensor, like a hyperspectral sensor or something that can measure things. And they make this cool sensor, and they're like, hey, we want our sensor in space. But they don't make spacecraft. They don't make thrusters. They don't make solar panels. And they don't know how to cobble all that stuff together to make a full system. And so what they'll do is they'll go to another company that makes what's called a spacecraft bus, which is everything but the payload.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll enter into we'll put an agreement together for them called a hosted payload agreement, right? And the company that makes the bus will then arrange with SpaceX to get yeeted out into space, and then what they'll do is they'll have an ongoing service where they're on an ongoing basis providing power to the payload. And so you got the payload company that's measuring things on Earth. You got the spacecraft company that is like a landlord essentially to this payload in space. And so, there's an ongoing service.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could kind of call that a subscription.
And the sensor is powered by software, I would imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there's your software subscription to update the software and maintain the software.
And so for example, you could have a company that's collecting imagery,
mm-hmm.
and that company that's collecting imagery could be selling it on a subscription basis.
Yeah. So I mean, I would hope that makes it easier with raising funds. Is there's some kind of built-in recurring revenue in addition to all the other, hard things with hard tech. But you said something also that you talked about tiers. So I do want to know, because my audience is curious about how you structure your subscription pricing. So do you have set tiers? Do you do custom tiers? Like how are you figuring out what you're charging these clients every month?
So we have like a little piece of marketing collateral. It's a little document that has our subscription broken into like 4 or 5 different tiers. And the first tier, which is, let's say it's 10 hours per quarter, if you were to break that down, then what the hourly rate would be is very close to what our normal hourly rate would be, maybe just slightly discounted. So that rate would go from like $500 an hour to like $450. Then the next tier up, hey, you're committing to more time, you're committing to paying us more quarterly. If you take the amount of time we're going to give for that price, it goes down a little bit hourly. And so I think we've got like 5 tiers, 4 or 5. And if somebody comes to us and says they want something custom, yeah, we'll agree to that. Typically what people do is they say, oh, what's the word for this? There's a marketing, it's either a psychology term or a marketing term, but essentially,
is there a difference between marketing and psychology?
Like the tyranny of choice or something like that? You go into, this happens to me every time I go into a Mexican.
Oh, yeah.
Every time I go into a Mexican restaurant, I'm stressed out because there's way too many choices.
Right. 3 choices. Give them 3 choices.
I want you to
3.
Make like 5 things excellently. I don't want 20,000 different things. I'll order my thing and then I spend the rest of the time thinking about, oh man, I should have gotten chimichanga. And same thing if you go to a grocery store, they limit the number of cereals that they're willing to present to a customer, because if they don't, a customer will go into the cereal aisle, become overwhelmed, and then they just won't buy cereal.
Right.
And so you can't give too many options. You need to really limit things. And so I like having very simple options. I like to do this as well when I'm like, I've noticed that when I'm putting a deal together for a client, like a contract or setting up an LLC for a particular kind of structure or something like that, I tend to tell them, this is how we do it. Here are the 5 moving parts, and these are your options for those 5 moving parts. What I used to do when I was a younger lawyer is I would go through like 5,000 different possible variables, and you just see the client just feel defeated almost immediately. And they didn't want that. They wanted me to make decisions for them. And, I came out of law school thinking, well, I don't make decisions for the client. I give them every option. I educate them. And I took an approach that seemed right, but it was eminently impractical.
Mm-hmm.
The clients that I have are experts at other things, and they're really good at operating their companies, and they want a lawyer to come in and say, just tell me what to do. My first client that I told you about, that's what he wanted. He told me early on, he said, Jack, what I want in a lawyer is somebody who's going to go out on a limb sometimes and just tell me what to do. And sometimes you're going to be wrong, and I might get a little mad at you, but that's okay. But don't dither. Don't write me a 15-page memo explaining the pros and cons of stuff, because I don't have time to read it.
Right. So these days, if you did, they throw it into Gen AI and say, summarize this for me. Give me the TLDR.
Golly. So when I was working for this German shipping company, I remember early on there was a cargo damage thing. And so some of the guys within the company ran up to my office and said, hey, these guys sent us over a nasty letter saying we damaged their cargo. Write something back. So I wrote like this 20-page memo explaining the law and explaining why it was their problem because they didn't give us notice in time and everything. And they look at it, and these guys are all Dutch, and so they're just big personalities. Everybody, Jack wrote us a book. What is this? All laughing about it and like, this is what law school told me to do. I thought I was supposed to do this. And they turn to me, Jack, why didn't you just tell them to go to hell? and so it's important to know what the client wants and what their personalities are, and like, do they really want you to do that thing that law school taught you to do, or do they want you to kind of make a decision for them? And you know, sometimes if you have the wrong client and you don't put everything into a memo, you know, you kind of run a risk of getting into trouble with that client, and you know, maybe a malpractice thing. That's what you're worried about all the time, is malpractice.
Right.
But I really like having clients that we can form strong relationships with. And when we do have those strong relationships and they trust me, I know that they want me to just make some decisions and not write them books.
So you said some more things earlier that I want to get back to and sort of tie it into just your practice in general. You mentioned how if you set aside this creative work, because this creative time block, because you want to do templates, you want to do videos, you want to do other things. I'm curious to know then, like, what is the technology you're using to do those things? And then also, as a firm that wants to be more efficient and effective, leveraging the subscription model, what is other technology that you're using to like power your subscription payments, do these templated things, which may or may not be related to substantive legal work? So now it's like, what subscriptions are you paying for technology to power your practice? Essentially, is what it comes down to.
So for our law firm management software, we use Clio, which I don't love it. It's okay.
Said every lawyer leveraging subscription who's using that platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay. We have an admin person who sends bills out. When it was Bailey and I, we were just getting started. We had a couple of clients that were willing to swipe a credit card and run it automatically. I think we were using WallPay maybe. I don't quite remember. I think we were doing that. But I think it became clear pretty quickly that because the subscriptions we were charging are higher dollar value subscriptions, people didn't want to do it. So, no, we want an invoice and we're going to send you a check.
Brutal, but that's the industry you're serving. So,
all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, when it's $10,000 at a time, I can understand people not wanting to automatically be charged. I get it when it's a couple $100. You're like, I don't have time to. If you're trying to go volume, if you say I'm going to have 2,000 clients paying me this, you know, a smaller dollar amount every month. Oh yeah, you got to have an automated process for that. But that's, yeah, we're going smaller volume, larger amount of work for each client.
Right. I mean, and there's something to that, you know, that strategy. I'll tell you, with every new bigger client I sign on, I think, what am I doing serving small, you know, clients and all that? Because like, it's not as profitable, but it's meaningful, and that's sort of the mission of my practice, right? And so that's why I continue to do $20 a month and $50 a page. But for me too, it's like when I help that person out, and I'm now even just 2 years and 3 months of practicing, having my own firm, 10 years of practice, 2 years and 3 months of having my own thing, I have helped small business owners who started at $20 a month, $50 a page, and now they're paying me much more per month, right? So like where they've ever gotten there. So like kind of it's a little bit of a feeder process, but believe me, I'm just like, man, I should just target clients that could start paying me a few thousand a month every month. So I feel ya. Although I like, if they're charging it, don't they get the points and then they don't even have to pay it for 30 to 60 days anyway for the credit card? You know, even if it is 10. So like if they have a business card, like, I don't know. So something to think about.
Try not to beat people over the head with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
If they, you know, they're going to have accounts payable people who want to do things their way, and I get it. I mean, especially if we start working with some of these bigger defense contractors, they're like, they got their way of doing it.
Oh yeah. Slow. So if you thought lawyers were slow to change, just military government, you know, they're not gonna, move quickly. I think there's some systems running DOS in the government, right? I think there's some, our nuclear silos are still running DOS, I think.
If you're working with a like small, real brand new company where it's like 3 guys out of engineering school, they're like, oh yeah, we'll swipe credit card, no problem. We're doing things for the first time. We'll do whatever you tell us. But yeah, you start working with bigger companies, and they've got their ways, so it's
Yeah.
fine. And
So
we have an
Clio,
admin person who's amazing, and
yeah.
her, and she sends the.
So I know Clio has a lot of features built in. They integrate with a lot of other software. So like, what other sort of are you leveraging
We
other?
don't use really any integrations, although I think QuickBooks, but I think we actually had a lot of problems with QuickBooks integrating. I can't quite remember. Bailey does a little bit more of that runs. So we use QuickBooks, we use Clio. So for our export compliance to clients, and I'm gonna start doing this for our other regulatory clients as well. We want anybody in their company to be able to ask us questions. The reason being that there are so many different activities that a person within a company might do that might be a controlled activity, including like they're going to go travel. Hey, I want to go to Spain to visit my uncle for a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be working from Spain. Does that create a problem? Sometimes it does. And so they can submit a ticket. So we took IT help desk software called Jira, and Jira is a whole suite of different, or I think it's called Atlassian is the umbrella company, and they have a whole suite of products like Confluence. But anyway, this ticketing software, we played with a lot of different ticketing software, and the problem I kept running into is that the ticketing software the forms would be very simple. Like I could ask only simple questions, and I would have like a character limit on the questions. And Jira allowed me to create these fantastic, where I could format everything exactly the way I wanted to. I could, when I really wanted to highlight something, I could highlight it. I could embed a explainer video if I want, because some of the questions I'm asking are complicated. People don't always understand them. So if I can drop in an explainer video or have just like a brief explanatory text, it's great. And then I can have, drop down multiple choice questions where people can select something. I can have a conditional logic in those forms where somebody can say, yes, I'm bringing my laptop, and that might then populate more questions. So I love that software. One of the other great things about it is that once they submit a ticket, I can keep it myself. I can assign it to somebody else. Everybody on our team gets to see the ticket, as opposed to an email that went to Jack that Jack forgot to answer. Right. So everybody can see the ticket. Then what I can do on the back end is I can have my own forms that are like my checklists that I use for analysis. So I then embed that form into the ticket. I check through all the boxes. I get to the end. I state my conclusion. And then when the government audits this company later, they can see, oh, they actually put some analysis into this. They didn't just write back a quick email saying, yeah, it's fine. Because sometimes the government disagrees.
Right. So you got to
But
show your work. It's like math class, man. You're giving
just
me
like math. Yeah.
I'm re-experiencing those fears now. You're giving me reintroduced trauma to math class and showing your work. No, Jack, I've had a lot of folks on the podcast all talking about technology. I've had technology founders and experts, and I think this is the first time somebody said they use an IT ticketing system. But everything you just explained makes so much sense to me. And I will, at this point we're wrapping up the interview here, but my listeners have already heard the advertisement for my sponsors. One of them being Gavel, which does do a lot of this stuff you're
Love
talking
Gavin.
about. Yeah.
Loved it. That was one of the first things I started using actually. And I'm sorry. Did you want to say something else before I jump in about why?
I mean, just that they do a lot of what you're talking about, but they stop at the IT ticketing stuff, right? So like logic and all that stuff. So like they do a lot of this stuff. I'm going to go tell Dorna she's got to implement, they got to add some of these IT things to the product roadmap because that's built for lawyers, right? Whereas this IT ticket thing, it sounds amazing. And frankly, I want to adopt some kind of version of it for my practice.
If Dorna built an IT ticketing system that could do all the things that Jira does, I would start. Yeah. So we stopped using Gavel for one reason. And I had actually used it and I had built out a lot of corporation documents, like our own corporate templates and everything, and used that software for automatically populating all of them. And the only reason I stopped is we started using a platform called Shoebox, and Shoebox just does that automatically, and they have all their forms, and they also do the virtual data room and cap table management and all that kind of stuff. So just because we started using that tool, I no longer had a need for Gavel, but I would certainly revisit it for another use case that was similar. It's fantastic software. It does a really good job.
And I will say they recently launched. I had a special episode with Dorna on this fairly recently, they integrated Gen AI. It's called Gavel Blueprint. So if you have a form that you like, because one of the hardest things of Gavel was like, or any automation, you got to set up the automations. If this, then that. You got to do all that. Well, now with Gen AI, they just make 100 plus, suggested automations in a few minutes. And then you just have to go in and like make sure they're right and maybe add one or two things or tweak something here or there, because where it would take hours, days, weeks to get your perfect automation built in Gavel, now it takes a lot less time thanks to Gen AI. So that's got me excited because I'm a true solo. I wish I had more time to dedicate to building out automations in Gavel.
I'm actually now wondering if I could take one of my forms that I'm using in Jira and then do a Zapier link to Gavel. I keep wanting to call it Documate. That's the old name for it.
Right.
But and then link it into Gavel to automatically generate some docs. That might be cool.
Maybe. It's just it's allowed me to finally do some of the things that I've wanted to do because I just didn't have all the time to build all the logic, flows and stuff, conditional logic. So, I mean, we only got a few minutes left. Any other cool technology things before I have one more substantive question and then a fun one for you?
There are other things that we're building for clients, but we're working on an AI product to help do a lot of the analysis that we do. And gosh,
like your own GPT or you're using an off-the-shelf tool or?
So we're working with a couple different companies, one of which though does train AIs. And they have a background in training AI for schools and creating chatbot tutors for schools. It occurred to me that what we would want it for is only a very slightly different use case of being able to say, hey, we've trained you, we've taken this whole school curriculum and given it to you. Now I need you to ask you questions about my homework. Hey, we've taken all of this regulatory stuff, plus all of these secondhand sources describing the regulations and all this training material. We've given it to you and fed it to you. Now I've got questions about my export, or I've got questions about this contract. Very possible it could be a good little buddy for me to help me do the analysis, and then I can go check the work.
And if you could set up the guardrails so that it doesn't disclose confidential client information, you could make it a subscriber benefit for your subscribers, that they could get access to this thing when you're not available.
Then the question is, okay, taking that and then putting it into a FedRAMP environment. I don't know if you know about that. It's putting it into a kind of environment that's secure enough that it can handle very sensitive stuff, and the government would approve it.
If you found the right builders, now that might be then over. That you might be, that might be too much. But as an internal tool, still, it's like having a super, and then everyone in your team 10x's their productivity, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of your team, though, and this leads us into the last question that I want to ask you, is I see, your founding partner is a woman, one of the other two partners is a woman, and you have two of counsel attorneys who are women. You mentioned the other woman who was doing the $200 a month thing that was, that helped inspire you to do the subscription thing. What I found having this podcast is it's mostly women ditching the billable hour and like doing some innovative alternative fee pricing. And so you're like me, we're men, but you're like in the midst of a firm that, technically has like more women attorneys working there than men, even though the partners are split 50-50. Has that been like your experience? Like, what have you seen and what do you think is unique about you that made you say, no, this billing thing is not for me, this billing time thing?
Yeah, I just wasn't good at it and I hated it. I don't know what else to say about it. I just hated it so much. I had this tremendous resistance to doing it, and I still do, and I hate everything about it. I wish I could say that it was like some intelligent decision I made. It's not. It's more of a character flaw.
Then,
but I try to figure out where my strengths and weaknesses are and play to them. I think everybody should do that. If you're a soccer coach and you've got a kid who really sucks at defense but really good at offense, you don't try to train him to be good at defense. You just put him on offense. Right. And so I try to figure out what I suck at and what I'm pretty good at, and I try to do the things that I'm good at. And then I don't hate myself at the end of the day because I get to give myself little rewards because I accomplished my job instead of beating myself up because I sucked all day.
Right. And then, but I mean, and I don't want you to speak for them, but in your experience, working with so many women, because the ones that have been on the podcast have said how like billing time, like living in that world didn't work for them. So they had to go off and do something else. So has that been like, have you experienced that, working with so many,
I don't know. I know that everybody in our firm likes what we do.
Yeah.
I don't think I have enough data to be able to like compare. men versus women, billable versus non-bill, or hourly versus non-hourly. But I do know that we all get along really well. We all like each other a lot. I think it probably helps that we're not nitpicking each other over hours. And then at the end of every month, like looking at each other's work. So did you get enough hours? I think that could quickly become very unhealthy. We, you know, we focus a lot on having a good team environment and everybody being there for each other. We have a Monday standing meeting every week where half of it's just catching up with each other. We finish the call where everybody makes a gratitude statement, something they're grateful for, something cool that happened in the past week, and we just really want to be there for each other and understand what's going on in each other's lives. And I don't want to be reviewing other people's hours.
That doesn't sound like you don't have time for that kind of a thing in a billable hour firm, what you just described. So, I mean, thanks again so much for coming on the show. I just have one more fun question for you I like to ask all my guests. And that is, Jack, is a hot dog a sandwich, and why?
The better question is whether a taco is a sandwich.
Similar.
But so the part of the question, so is a Philly cheesesteak a sandwich?
I've asked that question as well for somebody's from Philly that's been on the podcast.
And I think one of the defining characteristics would be, is it two separate pieces of bread or one piece of bread that's split?
It can be both with a hot dog, right?
Have you ever had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that is folded over as one piece of bread? And if you would call that a sandwich, I would argue you have to call a hot dog a sandwich as well as a taco.
And we've also had somebody answer the question, is a Crustable a sandwich or not? Which you just answered all of these questions that I've asked guests over the years. Yeah, so okay, I like your reasoning, sound reasoning. I'm not purporting to be the expert, by the way. This is why I asked the question. But yeah, okay, all right. So Jack Shelton, a hot dog is a sandwich is where you come down on based on that reasoning.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I think that's a definitive answer too.
Okay, all right. Understood. If people wanted to learn more about Aegis Space Law or get in touch with you, Jack, what's the best ways for them to do that?
Aegis.law, that is AEGIS.law. If you wanted to email us, you can find it on the website, but it's hello@aegis.law.
All right, great. Well, we'll sign off. Jack Shelton, one more time, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Make someone's day by sharing this episode with them. The best way to get in touch is to follow and message me on LinkedIn. To get extra content, subscribe to the newsletter at www.lawsubscribe.com, where you can also become a paid subscriber to get episodes and content early. Until next time, this is Matthew Kurbis with Law Subscribed.